Good morning, participants. I can see the list growing already, so glad that you found yourself to our Auntie webinar this morning on a very important topic of giving and receiving feedback. It's not your usual face here if you're used to seeing my lovely colleague Mikael. I'm Henrikka from the customer happiness team, leading the team currently, and I will simply be facilitating this topic that is actually presented in more detail by our wonderful Auntie professional Margareta joining us here as well. So hopefully many of you are already familiar with Auntie, but we offer low threshold psychological support for everyday challenges based around one-to-one confidential discussions. So if you're interested, reach us from our website or look at your selection of Auntie packages if you are working at an organization that is already offering Auntie's services. A couple of practicalities. The duration of the webinar is about 30 minutes, at the end of which we will try to leave a few minutes for questions and your comments. So do keep them coming either in the Q&A section or in the chat, and you can also select whether your question is public or only for us hosts here. So do take that opportunity to really learn more about the topic and ask questions if anything was still unanswered in this brief time. But I think without further ado, I will pass the mic on to Margareta. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, so Henrikka already introduced the topic really well. Yes, we're going to be talking about feedback today, but that should be quite clear already. A little bit about me beforehand. My name is Margareta Maduris. I'm holding a master's degree in clinical psychology. I have some additional training in solution-focused brief therapy and relaxation therapy. And I've been working in cooperation with Auntie for over 4.5 years now, so quite a while. Except from my one-on-one work with the Auntie customers, I also write blogs. I've been writing blog posts for Auntie, but I'm also writing blogs for myself. And then there's, of course, the webinars that I'm holding, just as the one today. So here's a little bit of an outline what we're going to be talking about today. So this first, we're going to go a little bit into the question of why feedback is so important. Then I'm going to give you some examples on maybe how not to give feedback, because you might have encountered the odd experience where you might have seen that feedback wasn't given so well, or you yourself have noticed that maybe that didn't go so well when you were giving feedback. Then, of course, to help you deal with it better in the future, there are some guidelines on how you should or could give feedback. And then finally, we're also talking about the important part of how we can receive feedback, because we all know getting feedback, and often it is maybe not that most positive, it's quite difficult to accept those. So, and questions and comments, yes. All right, so feedback is super important. I don't have to tell you that. You wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that already. So it's quite the hot topic. Each of us needs feedback on what we do. If we don't get feedback, then we don't know how to improve or how to do things better in the future. So often questions when we don't receive feedback are, well, am I going in the right direction? Am I doing the right things? Should I be doing things differently? And especially in the environment of starting a new position, a new role, or new tasks, feedback is especially important because it gives you the idea of how things ought to be done. And in addition, feedback is also an important input that guides what we do. So if there's a good feedback culture in an environment, then the chances of our activities being aligned with our goals is a lot higher. And that doesn't only mean in the work environment, it's the same in the private environment as well. On the other hand, feedback also arouses emotions. So as I mentioned, it's not always easy to have and receive and give feedback, but it's also an option, a possibility to make you feel heard as in listened to. Oh my God. Okay, moving on. So how do you give and receive feedback? So before we get into that topic, I'd like you to think for a moment about the last time you received feedback. How was it given? How did it feel to you? Was it constructive? Was it encouraging? Or did it feel like an accusation? And after you've received the feedback, what happened? Where did the feedback lead to? Did something change? Did you change something? Did you feel better about the overall situation? It has an effect on the situation in itself, and ideally it will improve the situation. So the better we can give corrective feedback, the more likely it can be the behavior can be corrected, right? That one should be obvious. And on the receiver end, how do you yourself perceive feedback when it's given to you? Do you take it? Do you take the feedback that you are giving, or is this sometimes difficult? Do you have you noticed in yourself that you get defensive, or that you attack back, or even withdraw from the situation, or is that something that you don't really notice in yourself? And then, and the last point, like, how do you deal with positive feedback? Are you, like so many others, struggling with receiving positive feedback, or is this something that you feel quite confident to accept, or, receive? Well, let's find out. Overall, the idea is that the better you are, or we are, at giving feedback, the more likely we are to see things right. So the better we can give corrective feedback, especially, the more likely it is that the behavior or the situation will be corrected in the future. That's why it's so important. Let's look at a situation, or maybe some characteristics of a situation in which feedback hasn't been presented very well. So first of all, the thing that I think a lot of people fear around feedback is the tone. It's when it's irritated and formulated in with an aggressive attitude, it's not a nice feeling to receive feedback. And then also when it's in a very public areas, as many listeners as possible, makes it even harder to hear that. Or overall statements like "you always," "you again," "you never." It sounds very personal, but also very generalized. And that's something we should definitely avoid when giving feedback. And then when it describes the other person's mistakes in detail. Imagine being in that situation. Maybe a supervisor is giving you aggressive, loud feedback in front of a lot of people with generalized and very personal statements, and goes really into detail how things went wrong on your side. Wow, that sounds like a tough situation to deal with. And then also the person might give reasons for the other person's actions, and gets, again, very personal and describes their personality or them personally, rather than focusing on the issue at hand. So words like lazy, stupid, or things like family defect, like these are incredibly personal and can be very, very hurtful. And if you probably are with me with the idea that it's unlikely that it's actually gonna make it easy to adapt the changes. So why would anyone give feedback like that then? If that's clearly not how you do it, why does it happen so often? Well, first of all, sometimes people haven't understood the effect or have no knowledge on how to do it better. It's not often that we are trained on being, on holding, giving or receiving feedback. Then they might have past experiences that feedback was given in that way. And they thought, okay, well, that's how I learned it. Then overall, the company culture or the culture of the environment in which the feedback is given, maybe that's how it's meant to do. Maybe the environment has a very, maybe like a very direct culture when it comes to feedback, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but sometimes it can be. Then also the emotions of the feedback giver play into this. If the person is under a lot of stress, they might not be able to formulate their feedback as well as if they were if they are relaxed. So here's some ideas on how you can give feedback. First of all, as I mentioned before, it's an emotional situation. So a recommendation is often to calm down first. And you can do that, for example, by first of all noticing how you're feeling. Like if you are the giver of feedback, you could ask yourself or feel into yourself for a moment, okay, how am I feeling? Am I angry? Am I super stressed out right now? In either of these options, I recommend taking a calming breath, maybe organize your thoughts a little bit before you approach the person with your feedback. Luckily, in most situations that most of us encounter on a daily basis where feedback is necessary, they are not life and death situations. It's okay to wait a minute or even an hour or two. And then I also recommend to try and understand why the other person is acting the way they are. Even if you can't know for sure, your own irritation will be reduced because you empathize with the other person, and it's easier to find a bit emotional distance and empathy for the other person. Then ideally give feedback preferably in a private or in a very small group, in an environment that intrinsically feels safer than, for example, in front of a massive group of listeners. And also, it is usually better to give feedback face-to-face rather than, for example, by email. We all have received emails in which we had some feedback, and messages, especially feedback, can be very ambiguous and we might misunderstand, or it can lead to a lot of uncertainty and misinterpretation.
Margareta, can I just check if you already moved on from the it all starts
No,
with...
this is the correct. Thanks for checking in.
Okay, sorry about that. I thought there was already some other slides supposed to be presenting. Carry on, and sorry for the interruption.
That's fine. We're nearly moving on to the next slide. Okay, but overall, when the direction or the feedback is indirect, then there is a risk for misinterpretation and face-to-face conversations, or at least a video call, for example, gives the opportunity to ask direct questions and to clear up any misunderstandings before they really start growing and festering. All right, so let's have a look at how we can give feedback, a little bit like a plan. First of all, try to get in touch with the person. For example, by asking them, hey, do you have a moment to talk about it? And in that first approach, I would suggest that you see, like, do you have a moment, and then maybe walk to the side or go to a bit more private room so you can have that conversation in peace and without too many other people having to listen to that. Tell the person as directly but kindly as you can what you wish to happen in the future. This is a very solution-oriented model of feedback. And the basic idea is that the problem is in front of us and not between us, meaning we are together on the side of, okay, we don't want this problem to persist. Let's see how we together or how we can come up with solutions so that this issue doesn't persist for too much longer or situations like this arise again in the future. Again, I recommend that don't tell them what is annoying about the other person's behavior, but instead how you would like them to behave in a similar situation in the future. Ask the person concerned what they suggest maybe as a solution for themselves, and then please listen. There's no point in asking that question if you're not willing to listen after that, because they might come up with a really good solution themselves, which of course is going to be easier for them to accept and then take to action than something that comes from outside or from you. Give an encouragement and say that you're happy to help if necessary. So for example, when we have to change our behaviors, again, we might not exactly know how to do it. So getting that outward encouragement may help to reach out earlier. And then also check how the other person feels about the conversation. Here's the next point. Justify the joy or benefit of or the advantage of the new solution or the new way of behaving in that situation. So rather than focusing on, hey, we don't want this thing to happen again, see what the benefits also for that person, but also the group in general are if these situations are handled in a different way in the future. And yes, once again, listening to the feedback of the person you're talking to as well is important, because this is not just a one-way street. And by listening to them, you make sure that they also receive that message that actually this is a dialogue. This is not just them getting a talking to. And yeah, then the point is to encourage and trust the other person's expertise. Most likely you're talking to an adult, but even if you're talking to a kid, for example, in the private environment, encouraging them and showing them that you trust them makes it more likely that the person will actually be motivated to change something in the person, rather than when you imply that they don't know anything and you know better. And finally, at the end of the conversation, I recommend that you check if everything's okay, if there's any further questions, if there's anything that maybe they need to help with the situation. For example, sometimes people need a bit of time to just, get their thoughts around the new situation and the feedback in general. Now we come to another interesting point, and it's about how we receive feedback. And receiving feedback is often difficult. The problem is that there's something that you or the person who's receiving the feedback should be doing differently, and that can feel very personal, especially in the work environment. A lot of people identify themselves a lot through their work, so that's an important factor. So what do you do when someone corrects you? First of all, listen and breathe. The world's not ending. You're receiving some feedback. You're not you're not going to prison. Okay. Then thank them for speaking up. It's not easy to give feedback for a lot of people. So thanking them shows appreciation and might also make it easier for you, by hearing yourself thank them, to maybe come with a bit more of an open mindset to the conversation. Again, the switching of perspective. Try to see the situation from the point of view of the other person. Why are they giving this feedback? Is it to undermine you and be really mean, or is there perhaps really something that you could be doing to make everyone's life a bit easier? And then if you see the need for it, if you think that's appropriate, then apologize for the behavior and make sure that you understood their wish. For example, by repeating what you want to change in the future and how you handle situations like this. and then agree on a way forward. Positive feedback strengthens performance, learning, resilience, and performance at the work community. That's why it's really important that there's also times for positive feedback, ideally regularly. When you get positive feedback, lots of people struggle to receive positive feedback. And there we are. Try to accept it. You don't necessarily have to believe it in the situation. I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with, but just receive it. Don't tell them, no, it was nothing, or no, it wasn't that great. No, just receive it for now. Thank them. Again, you don't necessarily have to fully believe that you deserve the feedback, but by thanking them, you're acknowledging their effort of them giving you feedback. And if you want, you can give a feedback back. Sometimes that can be a little, feel a little awkward to just, oh no, you look great. But if you come up with something that might be suitable, that doesn't feel too, forced, then go ahead, give them feedback, positive feedback back. Here's some takeaways for you. Or like some homework actually. Give your colleagues some nice feedback. Ideally something based on their effort on the things that do well, rather than something that like looks or stuff that they can't really change much. Things that we put effort in are usually the things that we find best when we get feedback on. So for example, in a successful job, or a characteristic or trait of theirs that you appreciate. Yes. Okay, let's go to the takeaways. As always, whether you're receiving or giving feedback, calm your mind first. Take a few breaths and just listen, or calm yourself down before you react in any way. Turn the problem into a wish when you're giving feedback. Take care of the connection. It's a person-first conversation. It's not the solution or the situation that should be solved, hopefully, after this conversation is actually secondary, because the kind of relationship you have with the other person, if you prioritize that, automatically feedback will be more friendly and empathetic. All right, so we have a little bit of time left, not much, but maybe we can do 1 or 2 questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Margareta. That's a great introduction to the topic of feedback. We now have a bit more than 5 minutes actually left for questions and comments. Something that came up was that does it matter who the feedback comes from in the work context, for example, whether it's a team member or a manager? Are they equally important, or what would you say about that?
Well, first of all, they might not feel the same. If you're receiving feedback from your supervisor or the CEO of the company, I think it feels very different when your bestie at work tells you, hey, by the way, could you, so it might immediately not feel the same, because if it's someone on a higher level in the corporation or the organization, then yeah, it feels a bit more like an order perhaps. And of course, that also means that to a certain extent, there is a difference, because when your supervisor tells you this needs to change in the future, then there might be repercussions if nothing is done in the direction. On the other hand, ideally, it shouldn't feel like a massive attack or like a thing that you have to absolutely follow straight away, and you know how to do it and you can't do it wrong ever again, because ideally we get together as people rather than as work tools. And there was something else maybe it's going to come back to me, but yeah,
I think that explains it quite nicely, and I've also understood that it does matter for in terms of positive feedback as well, that it's also important to give it sort of top down, so to say, not only between the team members. But there are some excellent other questions as well. First would be, how do you handle feedback you receive but disagree with?
Okay, that's actually a really good question, and a tricky one too. Well, I think it also depends a little bit on the situation. If we are talking about a situation that might have different ways of approaching it, right? Where you know for sure that, for example, is dealing with a situation a certain way can also be fruitful, then there might be room for discussion. In the situation itself, however, because again, it's not actually so much about, okay, now we have to figure this thing out completely, but it's about opening up the conversation. I do recommend going with, all right, and I will take this into consideration. These are some good thoughts. Let's see how we go on with that in the future. And maybe at a later point, you might want to bring up again why you think maybe that there's also other ways to approach the situation that might be successful. So in that situation itself, I don't know if I would argue so much about it, because also then maybe tempers might rise and the conversation might become a little heated. But at a later point, you could bring that up and see if you can come to an agreement that is mutually acceptable.
Excellent. And then there is a kind of a question for the similar situation, but from the giver's point of view, does the same tip apply for if you try to give constructive feedback which does not meet the expectations of the receiver? So when you're the giver, who should have the main responsibility to come up with a compromise, and how should that be handled from the giver's perspective?
Yeah. So first of all, ideally, in a conversation like that, it should be a listening and talking exercise. If you are the one giving the feedback and then you hear something, for example, disagreement on the way or the type of feedback that was received, then your job, first of all, is to listen to that. And then again, I think I mentioned that ideally we want to look at the problem next to each other, so that it's basically something we face together rather than something that's in between us. So if you think of it this way, you can maybe even answer your own question. If the goal is that you together work as a team to ideally reduce the chance of this issue or this problem arising again in the future, then it might be easier also to continue this dialogue with how or what feedback is given.
And then perhaps a final one, now that the time is soon running out. Very good question, in my opinion, on what if the receiver becomes angry or very upset when they are given feedback?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? It's a difficult situation. Even also here, I recommend empathy to until the point that it's like safe. If you are able to, in that situation, first of all, notice that this conversation is heated, then you can bring it up. Okay, I noticed that this conversation is getting quite heated, or I noticed that you seem a little upset. Would it be okay if we postpone this conversation to a later point so that we can both have a calmer mindset, and there might be the conversation might overall be more fruitful. So you probably don't have to figure this out right in this moment, and it's okay to give each other time to calm down. If it's more on one side, then that's clearly one person who needs to calm down more, but you probably also a little stressed by, for example, their reaction.
Very good. Very good tips. And now that there was one more question, I'm tempted to just give it one more minute. So are there any additional tips beyond those that were already shared in the webinar on the best way to give feedback about passiveness? Someone being passive.
Oh, okay. Okay. So being too passive in the work environment.
There's no further context in
Okay.
this, but I think that can be assumed. So whether there are anything that could be added to those that were already shared previously, or is it something that pretty much follows the same overall model of giving feedback?
Okay. Usually the people being passive in environments like that has something to do either with their personal background or maybe their personality a little bit more. People who tend to be passive are often a bit shy, maybe introverted. And in that scenario, the same rules for giving feedback apply, but I would recommend to be extra kind. When we're dealing with someone who is shy or passive, then there might be some worries and fear that this person is experiencing. So kind of touching them with even softer gloves would be recommended in that situation, I think.
That sounds good. And that specification was that by passive, they meant not contributing to the teamwork, not being interested in achieving common goals. So yes, in the work context.
Yeah, okay. So then I want to just add this. People have reasons to be passive. For example, lack of motivation, no alignment with the goal, stuff that happens in their private life that makes it difficult. I recommend empathy in this situation and trying to be interested rather than judgmental. I know this is difficult to have someone who is very passive in a team, but often we don't see the whole picture. We don't know what's going on in their lives. So approaching the situation with a sledgehammer is probably not going to help. But if you are showing genuine interest in figuring out why it is difficult for the person to contribute in a equitable way, it's more likely that you'll actually get an answer you can use.
I think those are excellent tips for that specific question. And now we are already slightly over time, so we'll bring this to an end by thanking Margareta, first of all, for your wonderful presentation and good answers to the excellent questions. And also thank you to all participants for taking this moment to develop yourself as a colleague, as an employee, as possibly a manager. I think you've done a great service to everyone around you, and keep sharing these tips forward, and hope to see you next time in Auntie webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you, and have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Bye.